Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of the autumn series of ESCoE economic measurement webinars. We're just going to make a slow start here. I think there's still lots of people coming in, but we'll just do a little bit by way of introduction, and I'm sure people will join us as we do that. So my name is Josh Martin. I'm a topic lead for the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, the ESCoE. It's my pleasure to be chairing this session. Fortunately, you won't hear too much from me today because we're joined by Jeegar Kakkad from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, who's going to talk to us all about anywhere jobs, which is this fascinating concept that they've come up with, very important and very relevant in the world that we're living in today, and all about how that's going to reshape the geography of work. Jeegar is the Head of Productivity and Innovation at the Tony Blair Institute. He was previously Chief Economist and Director of Policy at ADS, which is the National Trade Association for the UK's aerospace, defence and security sectors. And prior to that, he held roles at Jaguar Land Rover, Make UK, the Social Market Foundation and Brookings Institution. So Jeegar's got a really great background in industry as well as in research. I know he's a very sophisticated user of data, as I'm sure everybody else on this call is as well. So a really great person to be speaking to us about this very important topic. So Jeegar's going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. You can submit your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. So you should see in the little ribbon at the bottom, there's a button that says Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go through or at the end, you can put them in there. We'll only take those questions at the end. And when we do take the questions, we'll invite anyone who's posted a question to come off mute. We'll facilitate that, and then you can ask the question. So have a think of anything that you want to ask as we go through. And I think with that, we shall make a start. So Jeegar, over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. And thank you everybody for making time to participate in the webinar. As Josh said, I'm going to present to you our work on anywhere jobs, and the idea that if a job can be done remotely, fully remotely, that it could be done anywhere in the world, and our attempt to try to measure the number of jobs in the UK at least that were anywhere jobs, and so therefore vulnerable to outsourcing or offshoring. And so, when we're thinking about what jobs could be done abroad, we kind of have three motivations here. One was just not whether a job could be done from home, but really can it be done fully remote, full-time, away from the office. And we're taking some inspiration from work during the pandemic. It's Corn and Petto here. I've got Corn and Petto and others that used ONET to calculate the impact of social distancing rules during the pandemic and whether a job really needed to be in the office or not. We also took inspiration from an economist called Richard Baldwin, who talked about the globotics of evil and how a wave of artificial intelligence, remote intelligence, is going to come for white-collar jobs and create competition, global competition, expand the labor market globally, and that would have significant political, economic, and social implications. But also from the pandemic itself, many people had to work from home, and that accelerated the investment in remote technology, and it also accelerated changes in working practices because we all had to adapt to being at home. That it kind of accelerated that wave of remote working. And as Josh said, my background was very much in working with industry over the past 20 years, and seeing how the UK is still very much living with the economic, the social, the political impact of automating and offshoring manufacturing jobs. If we are going to see this wave of remote work and be able to work from anywhere in the world, that's going to come faster because of the pace of technology, but also it's going to have significant implications. So we want to get a handle on these jobs so that we can begin to think about those economic, social, political consequences and how governments can get ahead of the curve, as it were. But first, we had this knotty problem of what jobs can be done offshore. And in a sense, what I'm going to do is walk you through kind of 4 steps of how we tried to crack this problem. The first was to get a list of about 800 to 1,000 occupations from ONET, and just eyeballing it to say, what do we think as a group of economists jobs can be done abroad? We then tried to look at the kind of what are the actual tasks and then the actual kind of context within that work is done and that work is conducted, and what do those tasks and those work contexts say about the job and mean that it needs to actually be done somewhere in person, or does it really need to be done, or can it be done anywhere in the world? We then tried to get a little bit more sophisticated. We'll go through this in detail about our approach. Is how do you, if you've got a list of kind of tasks and work contexts, what kind of, can we use a model to create a predictive set of context that really says, okay, here's a job that needs to be somewhere, and therefore the opposite is if it doesn't hit that criteria, it can be done anywhere. And then we had to map that data from ONET, which is a US database, to the UK. But we'll walk you through each of those in turn. Just to kind of let you know the data sets we used. We used ONET, which is the, if you're not familiar with it, is the Occupational Information Network data set. It's a statistical database, a survey that's sponsored by the US Department of Labor, has all over 1,000 occupations in it. And it has a range of kind of worker and occupation-oriented characteristics. The skills and the experience of the workers in these occupations, but also kind of what are they actually doing. And each of those occupations, for our purpose in this project, is scored against a range of these characteristics, but in particular scored against a range of 100 distinct work activities and context metrics. So every individual surveyed is asked to kind of provide how relevant this work activity or this context is to their job. One thing to note with this data set and that the November 2020 release is this is pre-pandemic responses to activity and context metrics. The respondents are kind of thinking about their job in the context pre-pandemic, when most of what they might have been doing would have been in the office or physical location. When we did this analysis, we didn't have any further releases, so the survey responses might have changed since then. So it's potentially an interesting issue to come back to. And then when we're moving to the UK context, we use the UK Labour Force Statistics, ONS, and looking at financial year data from April 2019 to April 2020. So I'm going to walk you through quickly a little bit through each of these stages. The first stage we did was to take those ONET occupations and create a manual flag for what occupations we thought could be done from anywhere in the world or had to be done somewhere physically in located there. As I said, we used the work activities and the work context as the key job characteristics. And of the just over 1,000 occupations in ONET, 847, almost 850, appear in the work activities and work context, so that we have data on the tasks and the context for those 850 jobs. So the first pass we did is take this list of jobs, and 4 of us here at the Institute manually went through all 847 and just put a 1 or a 0 next to the occupation if we thought that job could be needed to be done somewhere, not offshoreable, really had to be there, be somewhere physically in place, or it had to be, we thought it could be done fully remotely. And this threw up some interesting conversations. We were doing this in kind of the spring of 2021 and disagreeing about things like therapy. Pre-pandemic, you would have said, you're going to go to a therapist, you need to be there in person every week, month, whatever. Post-pandemic, lots of people, myself included, I started therapy in the middle of the pandemic, and I did it all remotely. We also had debates about teaching and academics. Teaching went from in-person to virtual, and how do we score that in our manual flagging? So it led to some interesting debates. We didn't necessarily get to consensus, and it threw up some challenges. And we did these manual flags because it just gave us a baseline to work against, to say, okay, if we're going to develop a model that tells us what jobs can be done from home and what jobs can be done, what jobs need to be done in person, and what jobs can be done anywhere, we need some metric against which to check the accuracy and the validity of the model. and to kind of, so it allows us to iterate the model. And we use these manual flags as a check. The next bit that we had to do was just take those ONET work contexts and work activities and standardize them so that we could use them and fill them into our model. And let me explain that in a little bit. So with the work activity and the work context, for every occupation, what ONET does is it sends out a survey to participants, and it asks them to rank the importance of a particular work context or work activity on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not that important, 5 being very important. And in each occupation, you're going to get an average of what the respondents said. And the same with the work context. So work activity, you really need to think about those as the tasks that someone does that are kind of potentially relevant to their job. So whether it's analyzing data, determining compliance with standards for an accountant, or face-to-face contact and dealing with customers on a daily basis for a cashier. You know, these are the kind of, what do I actually have to do day to day, and what's the context within which I'm doing that? We standardize the scores through this method, and this is a really basic thing, just basically convert your 1 to 5 scale to a 0 to 100 scale. I've got no light here. Bear with me a second. There we go. And what you see on the right hand side is just a snapshot of the those standardized scores. You see that, you know, for example, for a chief exec, you know, it's actually really important for them to their job to be developing and building teams. But for a quality and control systems manager, that's relatively less important. What matters more is coordinating the work and activity of others, etc. And you know, our spreadsheet would have been 847 jobs deep and 100 tasks and activities wide. Once we had that score, those scores, and once we had our manual flags, we then had to develop a model to find, as I said, what is the set of characteristics and context and activities that really tell us whether a job can be done from somewhere. And we picked that for a particular reason. We thought it would be easier to define and find characteristics that require an individual to be in person for their work. Because if you know, through the work context or the tasks, you know, you have to meet face-to-face with customers 4 times a week, then, you know, yeah, you have to do your job in person. You can't do it remotely. So we thought it would be easier to build a model that defined, and sorry, easier and more intuitive and more accurate to build a model that defined the characteristics that meant someone had to work in person, and then take, okay, if those are the jobs that have to be done in person, the remaining jobs are those that can be done fully abroad, or can be done from anywhere, potentially abroad. So in doing this, we faced kind of 3 challenges. First, which of the 100 work activities and work contexts are relevant? And you know, you can have a range of mix in which ones and tell a story, but you know, we had to have a way of picking out of that 100. Within each activity and context, we also had to find, okay, well, what's the right threshold of scores? You remember, just flip back up, you know, you've got these standardized scores here. If we think developing teams and developing and building teams is important, well, where do we set the threshold? Where do we set the cutoff? Is it 75, which corresponds to kind of this task being very important to that role? Is it 80, 65, 60, 50? So where do we set that threshold of contact, that cutoff, once we're happy with the activity? And then what's the best combination? You know, is it 10 activities in context? Is it 15? Is it 4? What is it? And in a sense, what combination gives us the best, the most accurate, the most justifiable, the most informative and intuitive distinction between somewhere jobs and anywhere jobs? So to do this, we took multiple approaches. None of us had really kind of done any analysis like this before. So our first starting point was taking this, what we found rather interesting paper by Korn and Petta that looked at social distancing and trying to understand the impact of social distancing on particular sectors in the US. Just to kind of brush up our chops on working with the ONET data set, we also replicated the Blinder automation and offshoreability index. We then used a variety of other methods to kind of help guide our work, point us in some quick and dirty kind of analyses to see which activity context best matched our flag. Again, rather than picking subjectively out of the context and bundling them together, and we use the data to guide us to something that is more meaningful and more intuitive and more informative, rather than, as I said, just being subjective. And the last bit is trying to create a kind of an algorithm, a formula that maximized an accuracy score across 4 different metrics. We'll come on to some of these in a second. So first, starting point with replicating this Korn and Peto paper that, as I said, really wanted to understand the impact of social distancing during the pandemic on a variety of occupations and sectors in the US. And what they tried to do is find characteristics from ONET, from the work activities and the work context, that says, okay, these set of characteristics mean an occupation has to be done in person and that therefore is the most impacted by social distancing rules. What Korn and Peto did is through their own methodology, they came up with these 15 tasks, work activities, and a set of context flags. And they grouped them into 3 different categories. Teamwork, so you have to be there working with teams. And there are 5 different tasks that kind of fit with that. They had customer focused, because you really have to be involved. You're looking after another individual or dealing with an individual kind of face to face, or present, whether you had to be physically present at a location. And what they did is, they basically said, if an occupation is, it's on average, and within the teamwork, the customer, the presence category is above a certain threshold, and they average the scores across all these tasks, the 5 tasks within teamwork, the 5 tasks in customer, and the 5 tasks in presence to come up with a teamwork score, a customer score, and a presence score. And then they also said, if they tick the box on that work context flag, then this is a job that has to be done in person. And it would be difficult for due to home and therefore have an economic impact because of social distancing. We're really drawn to this because, again, this is a really clear way to say, okay, this is a job, this is a way to measure and identify jobs that have to be done in person, which is what our top line objective was. When we took this, and this was interesting, when we replicated it, one of the things we found is there was actually only 12 or 13 of these 15 tasks that were actually determinative. There were 2 or 3, maybe 4 that were kind of freebies, as it were, kind of helped round out the story, but didn't actually do any heavy lifting in terms of determining which occupations had to be done in person, therefore affected by social distancing. But this gave us a starting point for a set of tasks and a set of contexts that we could use as okay, wait, this is a good place to start when we're building our own model. We then did some really basic pairwise correlation. Again, we're starting with, and I think what you see here is in the columns and in the rows, rows and columns, is we're starting with the Korn and Peto activities and tasks and saying, okay, what can we learn from these correlations? We use this correlation both at the beginning and at the end, and I'll come back to the end bit later, but just again, okay, wait a minute, what can we learn from these correlations? Are there any other factors, activities, context that we need to be paying attention to? So for example, Korn and Peto don't include coaching and developing others, but what we see here is that actually coaching and developing others actually correlates pretty highly with coordinating the work activities of others, guiding, directing, and motivating. And so, these correlations, we use them to give us some additional set of activities and contexts that we could explore. So expanding that list from 15, 17, 18 work activity contexts, now we're building up a kind of a longer list of activities that we can explore. And one of the other things we'll do, and I'll just mention it very quickly, is a lasso regression on our subjectivity flag, or subjective flag, sorry. And just taking each of those 100 work activities, those work contexts, and saying, okay, to what degree do they predict or help predict our subjective flags? And what you see in this is just us kind of coming back and checking what Lasso did. And again, this is just to help build a long list of contexts and tasks. The ones in bold, performing for or working directly with the public, is something recommended and flagged by the Lasso regression as a work activity we should use, and we ended up using it. But the one in red, establishing and maintaining interpersonal relationships, we ended up using, but the Lasso didn't. So the Lasso model didn't recommend it. So this was just, again, as I said, building that long list of work activities and work contexts that we think matter to the ability to the job that needs to be done physically in person. That all fed in, as I said, the Corn and Petzo replication, the Lasso, the correlations, a couple of other different kind of quick and dirty analysis we did kind of fed into that long list of activities and context. We then developed a VBA Excel model to kind of check, given a list of work activities, how, and you said, okay, if we had 10 activities, and if an occupation has a score above 75 on any one of these 10 activities, then it's going to be flagged as it's not offshoreable, and we'll start there. And what you see is, you essentially build this set of four kind of stories, this four-way story of true positives, false negatives, and true negatives. Does this list of 10, how well does it match up to the subjective flag? How many false positives does it throw up? It predicts it in offshore, but we kind of disagreed. How many false negatives does it throw up? How many true negatives does it actually deliver? And we use these four things, these four kind of measures as I said, as a four-way kind of accuracy score to say, okay, how important is this particular work activity or context, and how does it help tell the story that we want? And as I said, we included any job if it's above the cutoff, and how accurate is this set of these individual predictors and the set of predictors to our story. And what we're able to do is build up a series of models based on the overall percentage flagged correctly, and so that accuracy score, but also comparing the overall percentage of jobs it considered as outsourceable or offshoreable relative to the overall number of jobs considered offshoreable in our manual system. And again, we're not trying to replicate the manual system, but more just using the manual system as a check, because there are problems with the manual system. And what you see here is starting with Corn and Petzo and using that as a baseline, we weren't that accurate at all. And so we eventually had to move away from Corn and Petzo. And just one kind of small note here in these models that you're looking here in column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and again on the next slide, you'll see an indication that says combined KP, which is Corn and Petzo, and DB9 variable model, for example, in column 4. DB stands for David Brito, who was our exceptional analyst that did all the analysis for us. So just to explain that one little variation there and to give him his nod and his due. Going through these models, what we saw is that sticking with the Corn and Petzo framework actually didn't deliver a high degree of action. We needed to do something that was slightly more bespoke and different. to find something that we felt was a little bit more true and a little bit more accurate. And so as we moved away from basing our model on Core and Peto and moving towards something more bespoke, we felt like we were getting a lot more accuracy in the sense of a higher kind of accuracy score from the model. And I'll walk you through a little bit how we kind of iterated these models to get to a place where we felt fairly comfortable that we had a good set of characteristics that meant a job had to be done physically in person and could not be done fully remotely. So the first thing we did is we started, as I showed you kind of up here, with kind of taking that Core and Peto basic list and saying, okay, and kind of running through our algorithm two things. One is, if we just had this variable on its own, you know, how many true positives does it actually deliver? How many false positives does it throw up? And then, you know, as you build out the set, if you added one more context, if you added this context, what's the marginal contribution in terms of true positives and false positives? How does it improve the accuracy of our model or not? And through iterating this, we came up with a kind of a core set. I think it started around 9 and 11. And then we really wanted to test, you know, one, that set, but also as we work through the list of 100 work activities and contexts, what is the actual contribution? You know, if we added this characteristic, if we added another characteristic, if we took one away, what's the marginal contribution? And so that we got to a point where we said, look, we eventually, you know, how can we optimize that accuracy score of, you know, it's never going to get to, we're trying to hit 100% of it matches our subjective flags, but can we get that, push that score as high as possible, and then understand why there are gaps and what occupations are problematic, and maybe we got it wrong. The other thing we did to kind of improve the model was try to vary those cutoffs. So not only are we looking at, you know, if we add this variable into our model, this work context to this work activity, you know, how many true positives or false positives does it add? How does it affect that accuracy score? But if we change the cutoff from 75 by +5, by +10, by -5, you know, if it's not 75 but 85, what happens? If it's 75, not 75 but 65, what happens? And again, just testing the sensitivity of the model and the variables and the cutoff in there. And again, through iterating this, I think what we found is the sensitivity, the 75 cutoff, probably just about right, and we could leave it there. But we were able to eventually get to a set of variables that we were happy with. And I can't remember how many iterations of the model we ran, but every iteration we would take some variables out, add some in based on what the algorithm was telling us in terms of the marginal improvement in the accuracy score. And the final list was somewhat subjective in the sense of, when it came down to it, I think we had maybe 15 variables that we felt like, look, this is really solid. These are truly additive and they're telling a cool story, a good story. There are another 6 that are very similar, and we should only really include maybe 2 or 3 of them. But we had a choice of which 2 or 3. And there wasn't any difference in the occupations, and there wasn't any difference in the accuracy. It was almost the differences here in telling a story. And very interested in telling the story, in that wider story, the political context of this story, as I mentioned right at the beginning. And so we got to a list of 18. There was a degree of selectivity, but only right at the margins. There were no freebies in there. So there were no kind of, oh, let's include that. It doesn't really impact it, but it tells our story. Like every variable in there is adding to the accuracy of our model. And then we also returned back to that pairwise correlations just to double check, final check that, there wasn't another variable that was being flagged as not having a marginal contribution, but was really being masked by other variables in the model. And if we messed around with it, we'd get a better score, we'd improve the model. We just wanted to check that we weren't missing anything. And so where we ended up was set these 18 variable model for somewhere jobs. Again, remind you that the objective was to find jobs that we really, had to be done somewhere. And then the jobs that didn't fit this were ones that really could be done anywhere. And we came up with kind of 3 buckets, very similar to the Corn and Pedo model. One, something that was locational, required you to be physically on site. The second was working with others and really requiring softer interpersonal skills. And the third bucket was more about leadership responsibilities and management. And these kind of reflect where we get to with anywhere jobs. So this gave us a kind of a universe of what we call somewhere jobs. What was left over was anywhere jobs, and we had to come up with the characteristics of anywhere jobs. This was a little bit more, less detailed, less rigorous, but essentially what we tried to do here is across the range of work context and work characteristics to say, okay, let's look at 2 things. One, looking at the scores that these different occupations have, the somewhere jobs, the positives in this table here, and the anywhere jobs, the negatives. Is the distribution of importance of this particular work context or task different? So that, somewhere jobs don't actually require a lot of working with computers, but actually anywhere jobs are actually, they're highly reliant on computers, for example. And we came up with kind of a metric, so is there a different distribution of the importance of this task or context? Or is there a high concentration of occupations of the anywhere jobs, in a particular place? And what you see, like, for example, on this, with interacting with computers, is 56%, almost 80% of anywhere jobs, the negative jobs, actually, the distribution there is they're really reliant on computers. And you can see that, 56% of, I'm adding these wrong, 56% of anywhere jobs actually very high reliant on computers. 23% of anywhere jobs very reliant on computers. And that distribution is very different than somewhere jobs. And going through all 100 activities and tasks, we came up with a set of characteristics for anywhere jobs. And these, limited physical activity, really because they're done on a computer and require detailed technical knowledge. The asynchronous, and there's no context for asynchronicity. There's no variable for time variable. But what we saw, there's a lot of emailing, a lot of programming, and so by default, in a way, those aren't urgent methods of communication. So potentially asynchronous. And then there was very limited responsibility, occasional decision making, limited impact of those decisions, and limited responsibilities for outcomes, results for coworkers. And very quickly, the last challenge, once we had that universe of anywhere jobs and somewhere jobs, and list of occupations that fell into those 2 buckets, we had to take that. We've been working in US data at this point. So we had to convert that US data over to UK data. And because there's no direct correspondence between these 2 different sets of occupation codes, we had to use a set of crosswalks provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US and the ONS here in the UK. And as you can see, we kind of had to go through 4 different steps, converting ONET occupations to the 2018 standard occupational codes in the US, to the 2010, to then the 2008 ONS data, to the 2010 UK standard occupational codes, that threw up some problems through that transition process. Some occupations in the labor force survey correspond to more than one ONET code, and so we had to kind of collapse those ONET codes and their scores so that we could give that one occupation in the LFS a score on terms of offshore ability. And then weirdly, there's a set of 9 LFS codes that are not in the ONS file, and so we had to kind of find a workaround for that. But once we did that, we could get into the results, analyzing the who, the what, the where, the why of anywhere jobs. And this is just a top line kind of to remind you why it matters. It's really, if left unaddressed, outsourcing, offshoring white-collar jobs could have some serious political and economic implications, similar to the loss of manufacturing jobs, but on an accelerated time scale. I've covered a lot of this. The thing that's important to focus on here is the types of jobs at the bottom. And you've got 3 big buckets, kind of numerate jobs in that first column: accountants, economists, insurance underwriters. You've got techie jobs in the middle, developers, tech and support, certain class of engineers, and then you've got creative jobs, graphic designers, marketing, advertising jobs, web design and development jobs. This is a set of jobs, just even eyeballing it, that we as a society tell ourselves are good jobs, are aspirational jobs, and will help you develop a career. That means you can have a good salary and have a good standard of living. These are the jobs at risk of being offshore. Looking at them, these tend to be better paid jobs in London and the Southeast that are most at risk. These are, as I said, the share of individuals in each earnings decile. You go up the earnings decile, you're more likely to be in an anywhere job. In terms of qualifications, people with anywhere jobs are, they've got degrees, they're more likely to have degrees. They're more likely to be younger. Some of them are younger with kids. Some are younger and single. So these are people, individuals with kind of their careers ahead of them in a way. And we're telling them these are good, sustainable jobs. Go get your degree, get a good paying job, you'll be set for life. It's not necessarily true. This just shows you where, a fraction, bit of a breakdown about where anywhere jobs are, but they're everywhere. They're going to be in every constituency, every local authority. But just because a job is an anywhere job doesn't mean it's going to go abroad. And there's a series of anchors or accelerants. That means jobs can stay here, and that might be friction, or it might be because it's attractive to stay here, or accelerants, which means it goes abroad much more quickly. And in the interest of time, I won't go through all of these, but essentially it's about the support systems that make it easy to stay or easy to go. It's about both accessing the skills that you need and whether you need to tap into a global pool or you're happy with the local pool of talent. It's partly about productivity and well-being and cost savings that might come from changes in work practice because of remote working, but also the resilience of agglomeration effects in large cities. It's partly about community, culture, and connections to culture, and partly about competition, about how do companies thrive in when competitive pressures about scale, about pace, about network effects. This could be a way to skirt around those and tap into network effects and scale effects. But that's it. That is a whistle-stop canter through some of the technical challenges we faced in kind of trying to come up with a number and a methodology that is credible, meaningful, and intuitive, that says, okay, this is what a somewhere job might be and an anywhere job might be. And then quick canter through the results and the, what are some of those implications, and pushing you towards, okay, well, what maybe governments can do about it to make the UK or other countries attractive to a potentially mobile global pool of talent. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really very fascinating, and I'm sure you've given us a small taste of some of the results. But I know from reading the report there's a lot more results in there. So anyone interested should definitely go and check that out. And there's also a lot more sort of policy recommendations and policy implications in the report as well, isn't there? Which I know you haven't told us very much about today, which is fine. We're here for economic measurement purposes, but anyone interested in the implications of all of this should definitely go and check out the report as well. I really liked, you took us through a lot of the sort of hidden choices in the research. I think this is something that we don't often see with some research, at least. You know, we skim through some high level methods and we get to the results very quickly, but you highlight very importantly that there are all these hidden choices underneath. There's a process. And I think it's a really good example for any junior analysts and researchers that we've got in the webinar audience about, you know, all this sort of sensitivity analysis you can do and how research progresses. A really nice roadmap for others potentially to think about following in the future. So just a reminder, everyone, to pop questions in the Q&A box if you have any. We've got a few minutes now. We've got about 15 minutes to take questions, so please do feel free. I can see a couple coming in, but just while we give people a chance to do that, let me pose the first one, if I may. And you used the US ONET data was very integral to what you were doing, and of course, I guess the reason that you used it is because there's nothing similar in the UK. Now, I've used the ONET data myself as well. I think it's very good and very valuable. But could you say something about whether you think that has those US data have relevance to the UK? Is there any potential bias that we're importing from the US by using it? Or, you know, did you think about any other sort of data source that is available in the UK that you dismissed? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Josh. ONET, we don't think there's any equivalent. You know, you look at Understanding Society or maybe the LFS and maybe one or two other sources, but it just felt like the richness of the ONET database in terms of those work contexts and those work activities, the tasks, and the context within which you do those tasks is unique in a way. I think one of the challenges we found with the ONET data, and maybe this is just a legacy thing, but a lot of the work contexts and activities are very physical and manual based. And there's not necessarily the same richness in activities and context for service sector jobs, or thinking about the way in which service sector jobs are changing. So, you know, I would have talked about the frequency of emailing, right? Actually, I email a lot less, and I'm using Teams or other kind of, you know, things like that allow different type of communication, slightly more modern communication, especially for remote teams. And I think one of the problems I kind of struggled with was when we were doing this kind of analysis and, you know, okay, what does the model tell us? It was constantly throwing up all these physical-based kind of work contexts. It's like, no, well, yeah, I get the physical stuff, but what I'm really interested in is these service sector white-collar jobs. And so sometimes we had to slightly adapt our methodology or lower our thresholds, or, you know, rather than taking it meets this criteria and this criteria, it's this criteria or this criteria. And that broadened and then opened up a lot of the white collar kind of professional, the service sector kind of work characteristics, and some of that richness came in. But I think, you know, we're in the UK, we're an economy that's 80% services. You know, having a slightly richer set of and modern set of work activities and work context, I think would enhance the richness of the data.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got a question from Cody Hill. I wonder if we can unmute Cody and get them to ask that question. Cody, if you're there, please go ahead.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sure, my question was, has the presence of anywhere jobs affected gender equality? So for example, are men and women less likely to work in fields with the 3 characteristics of anywhere jobs? Thank you very much.
Great question. I'm I didn't put the gender breakdown in that results slide. So two things. One, there was high prevalence, I think just about, I'm recalling, but I might be mistaken. I think relatively slightly more men were in some of these jobs than women. But the one thing that I think was troubling was that there was a high prevalence of couples with kids working in anywhere jobs. And one of the things we saw in the pandemic is when it came down to choices about who, between a couple, a man and a woman, whose job got protected, whose job had to sacrifice to do more of the childcare, do more of some other thing. It was the woman's job that ended up being sacrificed. It was the woman that was taking on more childcare, domestic responsibility. And I think one of the things we flag in the report is that is going to potentially, if there's a squeeze on anywhere jobs and squeeze on families, it tends to be the woman's job that flexes and bends to adapt to new realities, and that could have a gender equality impact as a kind of a second order thing. And Josh mentioned our recommendations. One of the things we really think is important in terms of that kind of the resilience of the labor market here is childcare, and making sure that there's a high prevalence of formalized childcare that kind of provides that safety net, so that if there are impacts, it's not being felt disproportionately by women.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And thanks, Cody, for the question. Let's go to Tony Hillier, who's got a question, I think, about the leadership occupations and how they fit into all of this. Could we get Tony off mute?
Yes. It seemed to me there's a dilemma here, because if the anywhere jobs need leadership, the leadership has to be somewhere. So that's a bit of a contradiction.
It's a great question. So the leadership bucket, see if I can find it, was very much, these are the somewhere jobs. So, if you're a leader and you are developing strategies and responsible for others, your job is most likely going to be based somewhere and not be remote and not be offshore. Now, it was the this bit for the anywhere jobs, asynchronous, and here I think maybe I didn't. The other way to think about anywhere jobs and the asynchronicity is that they're peripheral, and they're not core to the task of the business. So it's something like, I need someone to kind of update the copy for a website to reflect whatever things, but that's not the core of this. You can outsource that. I need someone to design a graphic for this tiny little campaign over here. You can go on Upwork or Fiverr and outsource that to someone in another country. So I think it's rather than thinking they need leadership and guidance, and if they're really critical to what you do, then you're probably not going to outsource that role. It's the roles that are peripheral, not core. It's a task that needs to be done on the side, and then we can bring it back, we can review it. It's not time sensitive necessarily, so it can be asynchronous, etc.
Doesn't that imply that the anywhere people have to come in to be led and give guidance?
No, that can all be done digitally. I know, for example, take the tech industry, for example. A lot of companies will outsource the back end web development, design of their website and their kind of app or whatever it is. And pre-invasion, a lot of it was done in Ukraine. And yes, you might have to have a call once a month, once in a while, but a lot of the back office stuff, back office web development for the UK was outsourced to Ukraine, and other places. And yes, you need to check in, but that work doesn't have to be done in person. And I think this is the thing that we're trying to say is like, actually, you look at the work characteristics and anywhere jobs, they don't have to have face-to-face contact with anybody in their organization except maybe once or twice a month, at most. And so, you know, it really is a different way of working, and a different way of working that we saw that was kind of accelerated in the pandemic.
Thanks very much, Tony, for the question. A really interesting issue with regards to these managers. I agree that I was sort of a little bit surprised to see them on the Anywhere job list to start, on the Somewhere job list to start with, and then gave it some more thought reading the report and came to a different conclusion. So perhaps Tony, you might want to have a look at the report as well. It's some really good stuff in there. We've got a question from Julia Schmidt, a very long question, I must say. So Julia, if we let you off mute, perhaps you could just sort of summarize this quite quickly for us, and you can take one or two parts of your question.
Sorry for the long question.
Not at all, go ahead.
No, very interesting project, and yeah, super fascinating that you showed all the hidden choices. I think my questions are two. One is regards to the data that was already discussed. I was wondering if you had looked into online job advertisement data, where there's a data set from Burning Glass Technologies, also for the UK. That would be maybe more timely, and I mean, is maybe a matter of access, but I use that at the moment to identify data intense jobs. So I was wondering if you had looked into that. And then the second is regards to your methodology, where you identify which activities and contexts are most predictive. You use a lasso regression, and I very much know what it means to decide all these cutoffs and everything. But I was wondering, it's more a classification task. So what does it give you to use the lasso? I mean, I know how it works, but just wondering what was the reasoning to mix so many different things, where to me it looked more like you build a training set and then you have a classification task. I hope it makes sense, just trying to wrap my head around it, but yeah, would be great to get a quick answer. Thanks again.
Two great questions. So very quickly, one, I think we used ONET versus Burning Glass or job advertisement sites, partly because I think we have an institutional bias towards official data sets here at the Institute, for better, for worse, and also wanted to not just look at new jobs, but also the existing stock of jobs. And using ONET allowed us to understand the kind of the whole stock rather than what's coming up. And you look at things like collaborations between Zoom and Indeed, looking at kind of the growth of remote jobs in places like Sheffield and Burnley and Worthing, and that's interesting, but it doesn't give you context. You know, yes, there's a 600% increase in remote jobs, but what's the baseline? So that's why we stuck with the official data. In terms of the lasso and decision trees and all that, it was partly because, and maybe we were just being overly cautious and being kind of, we never worked with this data set before. We never worked with these characteristics before. We're kind of all in unfamiliar territory. And it was very much like, very much a just kind of exploring and trying to inform our decision making. And I think you're right, we were probably just in a classification, categorization exercise, and trying to be a little sophisticated about it rather than subjective. But I think it was just because we'd never worked it, we tried different things. So we did we did some decision tree stuff. We did some, I just didn't want to present all of it, but it was just, how do we get a list of things, a context, and how do we create a long list of activities and variables to start with, and then we could work with those, and how do we make that long list in a slightly more informed way than just kind of making it random and being subjective about it. We didn't want to be subjective about it because we didn't want to miss anything. We were already subjective with the manual flagging.
Thanks very much, Julia, for some great questions. So we've got lots of questions coming in. I'm conscious of the time. So Jeegar's very kindly said that you can stay on beyond past a little bit to continue answering questions. So let me just say a few words of sort of closing, and then if anyone needs to disappear, they can. But please do stay on if you can and if you want to for for some additional questions. So I wanted to advertise the next webinar in the series, which will be on the 3rd of November, and it'll be presented by James Sullivan from the University of Notre Dame on the pros and cons of consumption and income-based measures of economic well-being. That promises to be a really fascinating conversation, and these sort of well-being measures are very important at the moment. We all know about that. And thanks very much everyone for coming. That's not to say that we're closing now. That's just by way of closing, in case you need to disappear. If you can stay, please do, and let's get some more questions. So the next one is from Rachel Scarf. So could we get Rachel off mute, please?
Oh, hello. Can you hear okay?
Yes, we can, Rachel. Go ahead, please.
Great. So I was at a conference quite recently, and there was some research from the IBS in Poland, and what they'd done is they'd asked people, employers and employees, how much of a wage cut they would expect to give workers who were working from home, and their results, they were quite big, so that suggesting that firms think that remote working is less productive. And I just wondered if you thought about that at all when you were doing this research about the effects of working from home on productivity, or remote working rather, on productivity.
Good question. So I wouldn't see it as a statement on productivity, but as a competitive issue. You've just now, with remote work, in a way, you expand the pool of talent, and that expansion can, I'm here in London, so rather than thinking about the pool of people in London, you can now think across the UK, you can think across the world, and once you do that, you start putting downward pressure on earnings and wages. I don't see that as a statement on productivity, but a kind of natural consequence of a kind of a deeper, more competitive labor market and a potentially globalized labor market. Through the course of the project, we talked to individuals that were engaged in remote work online, and one graphic designer based in Bristol said she was competing with graphic designers from across the world, in particular Israel, Brazil, places in Africa, Singapore. And within a month of being on Upwork, she had to lower her her rate by 50% just to be competitive. And that, for me, that's the dynamic. Rather than a statement on productivity, it's competition pushing down wages.
It's kind of a general equilibrium effect, I guess you're talking about. Great. Thanks very much.
No, great question, Rachel. Thank you. And Jeegar, I find that anecdote there really fascinating. I guess the other thing I would think about there is some sort of non-pecuniary payment or benefit that the workers are getting. So it's not so much that they're accepting a cut in pay because they're less productive, but rather they're getting sort of the benefits of working from home, perhaps, and they might be willing to accept a lower base pay because they don't have to pay for the commuting costs and any other costs associated with work as well.
Exactly.
So there's potentially an awful lot of things going on there, and the link between productivity and work from home, I think, or remote work, I think, is a very ongoing one and a somewhat contentious one as well.
Well, particularly currently when I mean, certainly I'm going to the office every day because it means I don't have to pay my heating bills.
A very topical issue, even as we leave the pandemic behind us. Hopefully this issue is not going to go away. This is really the direction of the future of work, I think. So all the more reason to be having this excellent webinar. Let's go to John, who's got a question on inactivity, which is a topic very close to my heart as well. So can we get John off mute, please?
Hello, thanks so much for sharing your research with us. So my question is basically asking, so do you think that the onset of remote work during the pandemic has contributed to the growing prevalence of working age inactivity due to poor health conditions, since there's about 22 million people that are claiming that they have a health condition, some of them claiming multiple health conditions, and do you think that that is partly to do with a lot of people working from home, affecting their mental health and maybe developing other back problems that have caused them to maybe distance themselves from the workforce? Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think it's a great question. I'm going to declare I'm not a labor market economist, an expert. Well, I think there's probably potentially two dynamics there, but I'm happy to like throw it open. One, I think remote working and in a way kind of web-based digital platform form of remote opens the door to people to engage with the labor market in a way that they might not have if it didn't exist. So I think it lowers the bar for engagement. On the other hand, I think maybe working against that, you've got the dynamic you've suggested that contributing to mental health issues and maybe some ill health coming from being sedentary or dietary patterns.
Jeegar, I'm so sorry, can I interrupt you? John, would you be kind enough to go on mute? I think we're getting a little bit of background noise. Just to make sure that we can...
Sorry about that. My bad.
Go ahead. Sorry, we were just struggling to hear you. Go ahead.
Well, so on the one hand, it lowers, remote work lowers the threshold to engagement and potentially enables people to engage in the labor market in a way they wouldn't have. But working against that, you do have the mental health, the ill health factors. But even with the working age inactivity, I think there's a range of other factors that are probably more determinant, behind the rise of led to the rise in inactivity than necessarily remote work. But the mental health and the other consequences feed into that a little bit, yeah.
Thanks, Jeegar, and thanks, John, for the question and for very kindly going on mute there. We're just getting a little bit of interference and struggling to hear Jeegar. I'll confess some conflict of interest and shamelessly promote a little bit of my own work on the rise in inactivity, which is something I've been working on recently with a colleague at the Bank of England. And it seems like the UK has an unusual rise in working age inactivity compared to other developed economies. So that would suggest something somewhat unusual about the UK. And these anywhere jobs, as Jeegar so eloquently put it, are not a particularly UK phenomenon because they are an anywhere phenomenon. So that seems unlikely to me to be the proximate driver. I think, as Jeegar said, there's probably many more things going on there as well. Okay, let's take our final question from Gianfranco. Gianfranco, if you're still there, could we get you off mute, please?
Yes, I am here. Hello.
Brilliant. Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Very interesting work, and I always analyze similar stuff. But I have one question and one reflection. So it could be that these somewhere jobs should be the target of UK policies for local growth, so not anywhere but the somewhere. But then, if this is the maybe a policy decision, are the somewhere job last stepping stone towards anywhere jobs? So at the end, we lose those high-skilled people, high-skilled and high-paid people.
This is such a great question, and one of the things that we discussed a lot internally before we published. I'm of the view that yes, you should. The UK should do everything it can to make itself attractive to remote work and kind of digital nomads and anywhere jobs. There are some highly skilled people across the world that are mobile and looking for good places to live. And there's a lot of great places to live across the UK. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a massive rise in the advertisements of remote work in a lot of places outside of London and the Southeast. And I think that's a good thing because, you don't have to pay, you can pay less than the London wage, but more than the local wage for some remote work in Sheffield or Manchester or Burnley. And I think that benefits everybody. I think the challenge for me, though, longer term, is that policy focus, the bulk of policy focus, or skills policy, or urban policy, or industrial policy should be around somewhere jobs. Richard Baldwin, who is a trade economist and kind of the spark for this research for me personally was he likes to say, look, technology is making the world of work more digital and more global, and the solution is that work has to become more local and more human. And And that leads to your somewhere jobs and putting your money behind the somewhere jobs, because those are there is still a degree of creativity behind the job, the collaboration and the human element, which means that they are sustainable over the longer term. And they're not open to these kind of general equilibrium pressures, wage competition pressures of the anywhere job. So for me, you do a little bit of both, but the bulk has to be making sure we're giving future generations and existing workers the ability to develop skills. That means they can have well-paying somewhere jobs, and that's yeah.
And a great place to finish. Thanks very much for that question, and once again a huge thank you to Jeegar Kakkad for a really fascinating webinar, some really great work, and as we were saying before, I think continues to have resonance even as we leave the pandemic behind us. So a really important topic to stay abreast of. So thanks everybody for dialing in. There'll be another one of these webinars, as I said, on the 3rd of November. Dial in for another taste of economic measurement research then. And for now, thank you and goodbye.